something very serious happened to American fast food, and almost no one talks about it anymore. These 12 major chains didn't just struggle, they started disappearing quietly from the map. Some of these brands once had locations on nearly every major street in America. Some of them fed entire generations of families for decades. But today their buildings are empty, their signs are gone, and most people never even noticed the moment they disappeared. And today we are looking at 12 big fast food chains that are quietly closing forever. Number 1. Arthur Treacher's Fish and Chips. A chain that once operated 826 locations across the United States, now has just 3 remaining. Arthur Treacher's launched in 1969 and grew faster than almost anyone in the seafood category expected. The concept was genuinely new at the time. Fish and chips served in the British tradition, built around a specific batter recipe that customers kept coming back for not because it was convenient, but because it tasted like nothing else on the market. By the mid-1970s, the chain had become one of the largest quick-service seafood operations in the country, and for millions of American families, a Friday night out meant Arthur Treacher's. That kind of loyalty takes years to build, and the brand has earned every bit of it. Then the cod crisis hit. Cod was the foundation of the entire menu, and when global fishing pressures drove prices up through the 1970s, the margins that had made the franchise model work collapsed almost overnight. Some locations swapped in cheaper fish to stay afloat. Customers noticed immediately. The specific flavor they had been coming back for started disappearing from the very stores that were supposed to be protecting it, and once that happened, there was very little left to stay loyal to. Ownership changed hands multiple times over the next 3 decades. Every new owner arrived with a different plan, and none of them held. The locations kept closing quietly one by one for 30 straight years. No dramatic announcement, no farewell. Just fewer and fewer buildings with that name above the door. Until today, only 3 standalone locations remain in the entire country. One of them still uses the original batter recipe. For a brand that once had 826 restaurants, that single detail says everything. Number 2. Rax Roast Beef. A roast beef chain that was once one of the most recognizable fast food names across the American Midwest, had 504 locations spread across 38 states at its peak. Today, Rax Roast Beef has just 5 remaining. It started in Springfield, Ohio in 1967 and spent the next 2 decades building something that genuinely worked. The menu was simple and honest. Roast beef sandwiches, a salad bar, baked potatoes, and prices that made a weeknight dinner out feel completely reasonable for a working family. The customers who came regularly didn't need to be convinced to return. The food was consistent, the value was real, and for a long stretch of years, that combination was more than enough to keep the dining rooms full. But somewhere in the mid-1980s, the company started pulling itself away from everything that had made it worth choosing. The menu expanded into pizza, pasta, a taco bar, Chinese food, and a full dessert bar. Dining rooms that had been working perfectly fine were gutted and rebuilt with solariums and wood paneling to chase an upscale image that had nothing to do with the customers who had been showing up faithfully for years. The people who loved Rax weren't looking for a fancy experience. They were looking for the same honest meal they had always gotten, and suddenly that meal was buried underneath everything new being piled on top of it. The costs of those renovations and the bloated menu destroyed the margins that had kept the business stable. Rax filed for bankruptcy in 1992. It emerged, changed hands, filed again in 1996, and kept shrinking through every attempt at recovery. The 504 locations that had once spread across 38 states disappeared one by one over the following decades, until today, only 5 remain out of the 504 that once lined the American roadside. Number 3. Ponderosa Steakhouse. For nearly 2 decades, Ponderosa Steakhouse was the biggest steakhouse chain in America. At its peak, it had over 700 locations spread across the country, and on a Friday evening, the parking lots outside those restaurants filled up fast. Ponderosa opened its first location in 1965 in Indiana, and grew steadily through the late 1960s and 1970s on the back of a simple idea that worked beautifully for its time. Affordable steaks served in a comfortable dining room with a salad bar that families could share. It wasn't fine dining, and it never pretended to be. It was honest food at an honest price. And for an entire generation of American families, it became the place they went to mark a birthday, celebrate a good report card, or simply sit down together on a weekend without breaking the budget. But the buffet and family steakhouse category that Ponderosa had helped build started attracting serious competition through the 1980s and 1990s. The dining landscape was shifting. Casual dining chains with broader menus and more updated interiors were pulling customers who might previously have driven straight to Ponderosa. The chain responded by trying to modernize, but the updates never quite landed the way they needed to. The core customer base that had built the brand was aging, and the younger customers who were supposed to replace them had more options than ever before. By 2003, the chain had already dropped below 400 locations. The closures continued steadily after that, year after year, without any single dramatic collapse to point to. Just a slow and steady disappearance from markets it had once dominated. Today, only around 12 Ponderosa locations remain in the entire country. A chain that was once the largest steakhouse operation in America now barely exists outside of a handful of states, and for most people who grew up eating there, the restaurant they remember is already completely gone. Number 4. Boston Market. There are only 16 Boston Market locations left in the United States. At its peak, this chain operated more than 1,200 restaurants and was considered one of the most promising concepts in American fast food history. Boston Market started as Boston Chicken in 1985 and built its entire identity around a genuinely compelling idea. Home-cooked comfort food served fast, rotisserie chicken, mashed potatoes, creamed spinach, cornbread, the kind of meal that felt like something a family member had spent the afternoon preparing, rather than something assembled behind a fast food counter. For customers who wanted a real meal without the time or energy to cook it themselves, Boston Market filled a gap that nobody else in the category was filling quite as well. The chain expanded aggressively through the 1990s, and the growth looked impressive from the outside. But the expansion had been fueled by debt that the individual locations couldn't generate enough revenue to service. Boston Market filed for bankruptcy in 1998. McDonald's acquired the chain in 2000 and spent years trying to stabilize it, but the golden era was already over. Locations kept closing quietly through the 2000s and 2010s. What followed in the 2020s was sharper and faster. Legal troubles, unpaid wages, health violations, and landlord disputes accelerated a collapse that had been building for years. Hundreds of locations closed in a matter of months. By the end of 2024, just 16 restaurants remained from the more than 1,200 that had once served rotisserie chicken to families across America. A brand that had genuinely changed the way Americans thought about fast food comfort meals now exists in barely a handful of states. Number 5. Baker's Square. A family dining chain that once had hundreds of locations across the Midwest and Western United States has spent the last several years shrinking down to just 14 remaining restaurants. For the communities that grew up with a Baker's Square nearby, the number is almost hard to believe. Baker's Square started in 1969 in Des Moines, Iowa, as a small restaurant that became known almost immediately for its pies. The pies were the anchor of the whole identity. Customers came for a meal and left with a slice of something that felt genuinely homemade. Over the following decades, the chain expanded significantly across Illinois, California, and other states, building a reputation as the kind of reliable family restaurant where the food was familiar, the portions were generous, and the pie case near the front door was always worth a long look before you ordered anything else. But the economics of running full-service family dining restaurants became increasingly difficult through the 2000s and 2010s. Labor costs rose. Foot traffic to sit-down casual dining chains dropped, as customers shifted toward faster and cheaper options. The parent company that owned Baker's Square alongside Village Inn filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in January 2020, closing 33 locations across both brands almost immediately. The chain emerged from bankruptcy later that year, but with a dramatically smaller footprint. The recovery never fully took hold. Locations continued closing in the years that followed as the broader challenges facing sit-down family dining showed no signs of easing. Today, 14 Baker's Square restaurants remain open. The pies are still on the menu. But the chain that once felt like a permanent fixture of Midwestern dining has been reduced to a fraction of what it was, and the number keeps getting smaller. Number 6. Roy Rogers. Most people who grew up on the East Coast in the 1970s and 1980s have a Roy Rogers memory. At its peak, the chain had over 600 locations across the country and was one of the most recognized fast food names in the northeastern United States. Today, just 40 remain. Roy Rogers opened its first restaurant in 1968 and built its reputation on something genuinely unusual for the fast food category at the time. A menu that could satisfy almost any combination of preferences at the same table. Roast beef, fried chicken, burgers, and a fixins bar where customers customize their own sandwich. For families with different tastes, it solved the problem that most fast food chains created by making everyone compromise. At Roy Rogers, nobody had to. The chain grew steadily through the 1970s and into the 1980s, and the loyalty it built in markets like Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York was real and deep. But in 1990, the chain was sold to Amasco, the parent company of Hardee's, and the new ownership had little interest in maintaining Roy Rogers as an independent identity. Locations were converted to Hardee's by the hundreds. The brand that customers had been loyal to for 2 decades was systematically dismantled and replaced with a chain that meant nothing to them personally. By the time the Roy Rogers name was revived by a new ownership group, the damage was already done. The network of locations that had made the brand a genuine regional institution was gone, and rebuilding it from scratch in a fast food landscape dominated by much larger chains proved harder than anyone anticipated. Today, 40 locations remain, mostly concentrated along the East Coast. A brand that once had 600 restaurants has been reduced to the size of a small regional operation still trying to remind people it exists. Number 7. Western Sizzlin, a steakhouse and buffet chain that was a familiar sight across the American South and Southeast, has quietly shrunk down to just 33 remaining locations after decades of steady closures. Western Sizzlin was founded in Augusta, Georgia in 1962 by a man who had developed a specific technique for grilling steaks that he believed was genuinely different from what any other chain was offering. The early restaurants built their reputation on affordable steaks cooked in a way that felt personal rather than industrial, and the formula connected immediately with customers in the South who wanted a real steak dinner without the price of a fine dining restaurant. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the chain expanded significantly, spreading across the Southeast and into other regions as the buffet and family steakhouse category grew into one of the most popular dining formats in the country. But the financial pressures that came with running a large chain of full-service steakhouse buffets proved difficult to sustain. Western Sizzlin filed for bankruptcy in the early 1990s and emerged significantly smaller. The recovery was partial and the closures never fully stopped. The chain changed ownership multiple times, and each transition brought further shrinkage as locations in weaker markets were cut to keep the remaining operation viable. The broader collapse of the American steakhouse buffet category through the 2000s and 2010s accelerated the decline further. The format that had made Western Sizzlin successful was itself going out of fashion as customers shifted away from buffet dining toward faster and more convenient options. Today, 33 locations remain open, almost all of them concentrated in the Southeast. The chain that helped define affordable steakhouse dining across an entire region of the country now barely registers outside the handful of states where it still operates. Number 8. Shoney's at its peak. Shoney's operated around 1,300 restaurants across 34 American states. Today, that number has fallen to just 58, and the decline shows no sign of stopping. Shoney's started in Charleston, West Virginia in 1947 as a single big boy franchise, and grew over the following decades into one of the most recognized family dining brands in the American South. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the chain was genuinely enormous, with restaurants spread across the Southeast, Midwest, and Mid-Atlantic states that served as regular gathering places for families who came for the breakfast bar, the hot fudge cake, and the kind of reliable comfort food that made the same meal feel worth ordering every single time. But the debt load that had financed the chain's aggressive expansion became increasingly difficult to manage as casual dining competition intensified through the 1990s. Shoney's filed for bankruptcy and spent years restructuring, while competitors with fresher concepts and more modern dining rooms pulled customers away from a brand that had changed very little since its peak years. The breakfast bar that had once been a genuine draw became a symbol of a format that felt dated rather than comforting to younger customers who hadn't grown up with it. Hundreds of locations closed through the 2000s as the chain retreated further into its core southern markets. The 1,300 restaurants that had once spread across 34 states shrank decade by decade until the brand became a shadow of what it had been. Today, 58 Shoney's remain, mostly clustered in a handful of southern states. The restaurants still serve the same comfort food that built the brand's reputation across 2 generations of American families. But the chain that once felt permanent across the American South has quietly become something close to local. Number 9. Krystal, a southern fast food institution that has been serving its signature small square burgers since 1932, has spent the last several years fighting to survive after back-to-back bankruptcy filings pushed it to the edge of disappearing entirely. Krystal was founded in Chattanooga, Tennessee during the Great Depression by 2 partners who believed that affordable food served quickly could build a loyal customer base even in the hardest economic times. They were right. The tiny square burgers that became the chain's signature were unlike anything else in American fast food, and in the South, the Krystal identity became genuinely cultural. Late-night runs to Krystal after a football game or a night out became a tradition that was passed down from one generation to the next across Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and the surrounding states in a way that no amount of national chain advertising could manufacture. At its peak, Krystal had over 420 locations across the Southeast. But decades of ownership changes and rising operational costs put the chain under increasing financial pressure through the 2010s. Krystal filed for bankruptcy in January 2020, closing dozens of locations almost immediately. The chain was sold and emerged from bankruptcy, but the recovery was fragile. It filed for bankruptcy again just a few years later as the debt that had never been fully resolved continued dragging the operation down. Today, the number of Krystal locations has fallen dramatically from the 420 it once operated, and the closures have continued into 2025 and 2026 without any clear sign of stabilization. A chain that survived the Great Depression and built one of the most loyal regional customer bases in American fast food history is now disappearing from the communities that made it what it was. Number 10. Sizzler, a California steakhouse chain that had over 700 locations across the United States, now operates just 74. And those 74 are fighting hard to stay open. Sizzler opened its first restaurant in Culver City, California in 1958, and spent the following 3 decades becoming one of the defining casual dining experiences on the West Coast. The formula was straightforward and effective: affordable steaks, a salad bar, and a dining room that felt like a genuine sit-down restaurant without the price of one. For families across California and beyond, Sizzler occupied a specific place in the dining landscape that felt both accessible and special at the same time. You dressed a little better than you would for McDonald's, but you didn't have to watch what you ordered because of the bill. The chain expanded nationally through the 1970s and 1980s, and at its peak was one of the most recognized steakhouse names in the country. But the casual dining category became increasingly competitive through the 1990s as chains like Applebee's and TGI Fridays offered broader menus and more contemporary dining rooms that pulled customers away from the steakhouse buffet format that Sizzler had been built around. Sizzler filed for bankruptcy in 1996 and emerged with a smaller footprint. It filed again in 2020 during the pandemic, closing more locations as the buffet format that had always been central to the Sizzler experience became one of the hardest-hit dining concepts of that period. The chain has been attempting a comeback since emerging from its second bankruptcy, renovating locations and updating the menu to appeal to a customer base that remembers Sizzler fondly, but had largely moved on. The effort is genuine, but the scale of the decline from 700 locations to 74 reflects how much ground the brand has lost and how difficult that ground is to recover. Number 11. Friendly's, a New England ice cream and family dining chain that was a beloved institution across the northeastern United States, has been through 2 bankruptcies, lost hundreds of locations, and is now barely surviving on a fraction of the footprint it once had. Friendly's started in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1935 when 2 brothers opened a small ice cream shop that charged a nickel for a double scoop cone. The concept grew steadily over the following decades into a full family restaurant that combined a genuine diner menu with an ice cream experience that became the reason most families went there in the first place. The Fribble milkshake, the awful awful, the sundaes built at the end of a meal that children negotiated for through the entire dinner. For generations of families in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and the surrounding states, Friendly's wasn't just a restaurant, it was a ritual. At its peak, the chain operated over 750 locations across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. But the economics of running full-service family restaurants with both a kitchen and an ice cream operation became increasingly difficult as costs rose and foot traffic to sit-down dining chains declined. Friendly's filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2011, closing 63 locations overnight. It was acquired, stabilized briefly, and then filed for bankruptcy again in 2020 during the pandemic, closing more restaurants and emerging with roughly 130 locations remaining. The recovery from that second filing has been slow and uneven. Locations have continued closing in the years since, including the permanent closure of the last Friendly's in Massachusetts, the state where the chain was born. A brand that had spent nearly 90 years building one of the deepest emotional connections of any restaurant chain in New England has been gradually disappearing from the very communities that made it what it was. Number 12. Quiznos, a sandwich chain that was once challenging Subway for dominance of the entire American sandwich market, had more than 5,000 locations open across the United States at its peak. Today, Quiznos has just 148 remaining. Quiznos built its identity in the 1990s and early 2000s around something that genuinely set it apart from every other sandwich chain on the market: the toasted sub. Warm bread, melted cheese, and ingredients that came out of the oven rather than off a cold assembly line. For customers who had grown up with cold sandwiches as the only fast food option, the difference was immediately obvious and immediately compelling. At its peak, Quiznos was opening new locations at a pace that suggested it might genuinely overtake Subway as the dominant force in the category. But the franchise model that had fueled that rapid expansion was quietly creating a crisis underneath the surface. Individual franchise owners were required to purchase ingredients directly from the corporate supply chain, at prices that many of them said made it nearly impossible to operate profitably. Lawsuits from franchisees began piling up. Locations that couldn't survive the cost structure started closing, not because customers had stopped coming, but because the owners couldn't afford to keep the doors open. The closures accelerated through the late 2000s and into the 2010s as the legal and financial pressure on the corporate structure became impossible to manage. Quiznos filed for bankruptcy in 2014. The filing came after years of closures that had already reduced the chain from 5,000 locations to a fraction of that number. It emerged from bankruptcy, but the recovery was limited. By 2026, a brand that had once operated more than 5,000 restaurants and genuinely threatened to reshape the American sandwich market had shrunk to 148 remaining locations, quietly serving customers in the markets where it still hangs on. 12 chains, 12 different stories. But the same quiet ending runs through all of them. None of these brands disappeared overnight. There was no single morning when everything fell apart at once. It happened gradually, across years and sometimes decades, through small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, but added up to something irreversible. A menu that drifted too far from what customers had come for. An ownership change that replaced the people who understood the brand with people who only understood the numbers. A cost structure that slowly made it impossible for the individual locations to survive even when customers were still walking through the door. What makes these stories worth paying attention to is not the bankruptcy filings or the closing announcements. It is the gap between what these brands meant to the people who grew up with them and what they eventually became before the doors closed for the last time. Arthur Treacher's on a Friday night. A Rax on a long road trip through the Midwest. A friendly Sunday at the end of a family dinner that nobody wanted to end. Those memories did not disappear when the restaurants did. They just stopped having a place to go. The signs are still out there if you know where to look. A faded logo on a building that became something else. A parking lot that used to fill up on a Saturday morning and now sits mostly empty. A corner that still feels like it is missing something even if you cannot immediately remember what used to be there. If any of these names meant something to you, drop it in the comments below. You probably are not the only one who remembers.